So on page 56 and 57, you have these three drawn. Here's my suggestion on what you're going to do, okay? As we talk about these things, on the left-hand side, these two bubbles, this is where you're going to write the definitions, because we're going to talk about them, supply and demand, and define it, okay? Then you're going to put on your ranching glasses, okay? How many of you have ever worn like those rose-colored glasses or the blue glasses, where you put them on and everything changes color, okay? That's kind of what we're doing, except it's not going to change color. We're going to think about it through the lens of a rancher, okay? So the middle, all three of them will have the word ranching, and you're going to put on your ranching glasses. And then over here on the right-hand side is where you're going to put your examples of these things in effect with ranching. Does that make sense? Okay. We are going to be looking at this in relationship to ranching. What does ranching deal with? When I say the word ranching, what are we talking about? Cattle and cows, not crops, not farming. That's agriculture. That's growing your food. Ranching deals with the cattle and the cows and that kind of stuff, okay? So when we talk about ranching, that's what we're talking about. If we look at this picture, you see a guy on a horse. What's he doing?
Herding cattle.
He's herding cattle. So when we talk about the ranching industry in the 1800s, that's what we're talking about, the 1800s, it's very different from today. Okay, are you with me? Now, let's look at our next piece. We're going to look at a concept called supply and demand. Okay? Supply is how much is available for people to purchase. Demand is how much people want it. Okay? How many of you remember when the iPhone 5 came out and the news was covering the Apple stores? What did the Apple stores look like? What do they look like?
Well, I have a question.
Well, hold on. Answer my question first. What did they look like?
Like a Michael Jackson concert was going on there?
They were crazy, right? Why? Why were the Apple stores so packed full of people?
Because everybody wanted a new phone.
Because there was a high demand for this new phone. Did everybody get a phone?
No.
Why?
Because there wasn't enough supply.
There wasn't enough supply. Okay, on that day. Now, did eventually everybody get a phone? Yes. But that specific day, not everybody was able to get a phone. Now, because the demand was so high and the supply wasn't quite enough, could Apple charge whatever they wanted to for that phone? Yes. Do they? Yes. Okay. So that's what supply and demand is. Okay, that's that relationship going on there. Okay. So what I want you to do, remember your circles that you have on the left-hand side, you're going to write your definitions. So write supply in one and demand in the other. Okay. So let's think about supply and demand. How many of your parents have mentioned, or if you've even noticed, when you go to the grocery store, the cost of food is kind of going up? Okay. The other day I went to buy hot dogs. I know, silly. I went to buy hot dogs, and I looked at the price of hot dogs that I was buying last summer for $2 or $3. They were $6. I was like, oh my gosh, when did that happen? But here's what's happening. The demand for food is increasing because now all of a sudden, worldwide, they want to have beef and they want to have other things. They're not going to eat just your regular grains and fruits and veggies. They want to have beef and stuff. Where does the beef mainly come from? Texas. Okay? A lot of it comes from Texas. So we're having a high demand and the supply isn't quite equal to the demand. But what does that mean for the people who are ranchers and farmers? They're good because you're still having a high demand. Now, if the demand were to drop away, what would happen to our farmers and ranchers?
They would lose money.
They would lose money, okay? But because the demand is high, they can raise the price. Now, which means you and I have to pay that price, okay? The video you're going to watch is going to talk about that. It's on YouTube. Okay, now I want you to put on your ranching glasses. Because we're going to look at this from the viewpoint of ranching. Okay? Put on your ranching glasses, and we're going to think about supply and demand as a ranching business. Okay? So, supply and demand in the ranching industry. Here's what happens. Here's why the demand is so high. Hold on for just a second. Listen, and then you can write. The demand is so high because after the Civil War was over, actually during the Civil War, both armies were feeding their men beef. Because beef was cheaper, it was easier to access than grains and fruits. So they would feed their men beef. And beef also protein, it lasts longer in your body, right? So what would happen is, when the war was over, what were people kind of hooked on eating? Beef, right? So with the war being over, where are they going to get beef from? That's where they got to figure out. So in your brain, I want you to kind of imagine the East, where New York is, and Philadelphia, and Massachusetts. Do they have any ranching land up there?
No.
They don't have any ranching land. It's harsh climate. It's rocky soil. They don't have a lot of open space. They also have lots of mountains over in that area because the Appalachian. It's really cold there. Where in the United States is the best place to have ranches? In the southern area. Okay. Texas is a huge one. Basically, the places that have lots and lots of open land. Texas, what do we have a lot of? Land. Okay, because we've just moved out the Indians and killed the buffalo herd. So, we, as Texas, have this area we can do it. Well, during the Civil War, where were all the men? The men were fighting, right? Who was taking care of the cattle?
Women and children.
Women. Okay, but the women were also in charge of the home, their house, their families, their household, the slaves, the farming, and the cattle. Which one of those can kind of take care of itself and they can ignore? The cattle. So that's what they did. They just kind of let the cows go. So some men would leave and they'd have 10 heads of cattle to their name. They'd come back, and because the women basically, I don't want to say ignored the cattle, but they didn't tend to them as much, this cattle industry boomed. 3 to 4 million heads of cattle is what Texas had in 1865. Okay? So all of these cattle, and we don't have a way to say, this is my cattle, this is your cattle, this is his cattle, this is their cattle. Okay? They don't have branding yet. The idea that hasn't come about. It's more of just trusting. I have these 5 heads, I can tell. You have those 10, those are yours, those are your 5. Okay? But because they've all intermingled and mixed and they've all had babies together, we now have 3 or 4 million cows that are unclaimed. Okay? So the men come back from war, and all of a sudden you have a high demand because the East wants cattle. And what else do we have a high, what else is high? The supply. 3 to 6 million unclaimed cattle. That's a lot of cattle. Okay? So, in your grid, or in your bubble diagram that you have on your page, you're going to write, we have our ranching lenses on, so you're going to write these on the right-hand side where the examples are located. Okay, so with supply and demand in ranching, we have an abundance of cattle and we have a huge demand from the East. Okay? We're going to move on to our next concept to learn, and that's going to be your boom and bust. Okay, so move to your next set of bubbles. So this was your supply and demand bubble. Now let's talk about what a boom and a bust is. When I say boom, what do you think of? Explosion. Like big cloud of dust or whatever. It explodes. It goes big, right? That's kind of the same concept. When you think of a bust, what's a bust? Like a balloon popping. It crumbles in on itself. Something breaks. Somebody in second period used the example of a card game. That if they bust in a card game, you what? You lose, okay? So that's what we're talking about. It's a boom and a bust. It's very similar to this concept, okay? Remember, we're doing this from the ranching perspective. So let's look at a boom and a bust with ranching in mind, okay? A boom is a long period of profit. Now, this could be a 2-year period. It could be a 30-year period. It doesn't matter. It could be a long time where we have a huge profit happening. And then all of a sudden, a bust, it always follows a boom. It goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Booms go up, something occurs. And it can be a little minor thing. It could be a huge thing. But something happens and then the industry or the company or whatever busts. And so that boom is followed by a period of sharp decline where your profit is going down to nothing. Okay? So, here's what you're going to do. You're going to put boom in one circle on the left and bust in the other. If you want to draw this little picture I have, you're welcome to kind of in between. So boom and bust. Grab your ranching lenses. Put your ranching glasses on. Okay? Let's look at boom and bust through ranching lenses. Let's look at boom first. Okay? Let's look at boom. 65, we already talked about this. We have millions of heads of cattle just ready to be sold. Here's what happened. The longhorn cattle were only worth $3 or $4. But because there was such a high demand for them in the East, we could sell them for $30 or $40. Now, if you think about it, these men came back from the war. They did nothing to these longhorn cattle. They didn't have to breed them. They didn't have to feed them. They didn't have to care for them. They just basically said, yeah, I'm going to take 100 and I'm going to pull them into my land. Okay? So really, have they spent any money on the cattle yet? No. And now they're selling them for $30 or $40? Wouldn't you call that a pretty big boom?
Yeah.
If I have 100 cattle and I'm selling them for $30 a pop and I spent no money yet, how much am I putting in my pocket? $3,000. Okay? And that's just for my 100 head. That doesn't count all the other things that I'm going to have going on, okay? This is what helped Texas recover from the Civil War. This is our boom in ranching. So, take a minute, write this on the right-hand side of the bubble that you have. Right, boom. Yeah, you don't have to add the 3 to 4 million cattle. Just do the boom part, because we already know that. So if everything's going great and wonderful, we're having this huge boom, and it goes up and up and up, and we're making major profit, and we're selling our cattle for $27 to $37 profit, what's going to happen next? We're going to have a bust, okay? So what is this bust in relationship to the cattle? That's what we have to look at, okay? We actually have what's called a disease called Texas fever that goes through these cattle, okay? The Texas fever goes through and it infects the herds. Because it infects the herds, it's actually killing them in Texas. But even if it's not caught and the cow is sold and it goes through the meat processing and it's sold at market and then people start eating it, what's going to happen? They're going to get sick. So all of a sudden, the East Coast stops buying the cattle. They say, yeah, we're done. We're not going to buy this. We're not going to take this as a chance, okay? So that's the first thing. So all of a sudden, we had a high supply and a high demand. What happened to our demand? It went down. We have no demand anymore, but we still have a ton of cattle left. The next problem, because of the Texas fever, ranchers wanted to keep their cattle separate. They wanted sick cattle here and well cattle over there. Okay, they wanted to keep the healthy and the sick herds apart. So how do we do that? Fences. Well, these ranchers didn't exactly have great knowledge on how to build the fences and how to have things that helped. So they just threw up some fences. They're called drift fences to keep the herds from drifting together. What ended up happening was what's called the big die-up. Okay? The big die-up. A big blizzard came through West Texas. And basically, the cattle were trying to hide and trying to get to shelter and trying to keep themselves warm. But because the fences were there and these drift fences, the snow piled up, the cows got stuck, and hundreds of them died. So now we have a high supply, a low demand. What happened to our supply? It fell down. But we still have no demand. So what's happening to our cattle price at this point? It's going down. Why are we having to lower the price of cattle? So people will buy it. Because are they going to buy it when it was $30, $40 and now they could potentially have Texas fever? No. And we don't have as many cows because we've just killed them all, or half of them, okay? So all of a sudden the supply went down and the demand for Texas cattle went down, and now we have a bust in the cattle industry. So we have our boom and our bust, and now we're busted. Texas ranching is at a bust at this point in time, okay? What we want to look at now is what the concepts of profit and industry mean and how that applies to ranching. Okay, so let's look at profit and industry. So move on to your next bubble map. Move on to your next bubble map. And let's talk about profit and industry. Remember, all of this is from the perspective of ranching. So profit and industry. Industry is the organized action. So this is an organized thing of making goods or services available for sale. Okay? Industry is organized basically the making of goods and services that are available for sale. Making this an organization where we can sell products like shoes or clothes or food or supplies of any kind, and then or services such as fixing your car or cleaning your house, making a house, building a house. And profit. You guys know what a profit is, right? Moneygate, okay? You make, I don't know, my Tom's pair of shoes, for example, okay? How much are Tom's worth? How much do you have to spend? About 40 or 50 bucks, right? But do you think it costs Tom's company $40 or $50 to make the shoe? No. Say, for example, just for number's sake, it costs them $10 to make the shoe. If it costs them $10 to make the shoe, and we are paying $40 or $50 for it, then they're getting $30 or $40 profit. Okay, it's how much money you make above and beyond what you spent to make that thing. Okay, if you go out to a restaurant, how many of you have gone out to restaurants? How many of you get a Coke at the restaurant or a soda or whatever it is? It's like $2.25, right? $2.50 for the Coke. Do you really think it actually costs that much money for them to make it? It's like a couple nickels, 25 cents, because they buy it in bulk and then they sell it and they split it out. But are they making a huge profit off of the drink?
Yep.
That's where restaurants make most of their money from, okay? Is from selling the drink. So a profit is how much money you make based on how much you spent to make that product. Does that make sense? Okay.
On Pawn Stars, they evaluate how much they paid for something and then sell it back to somebody for more than what they paid for.
Exactly. So, like, in Pawn Stars, you're right. Somebody comes in and wants to sell a Superman comic book. I don't know. Superman comic book. And Pawn Stars buys the Superman comic book for $30, even though it's valued at like $100. Okay? They negotiate it down to $30, and they buy it for $30. But they can turn around, and because it's valued at $100, and it may be like 1 in 3 in the country, could they sell it for $200? Yes. They can up it because the supply is low, but the demand might be high. Okay? So that's a great example of how they make a profit. Okay? So let's put our ranching glasses on. Ranching glasses on. Let's look at industry and profit from the viewpoint of the ranching industry. Industry and profit. So in the ranching industry, remember what we talked about earlier, how they made a profit? The cows or the cattle were only worth $3 or $4, but they made a profit of $36 or more. Okay? They made a good little profit off of it. That's your profit example for ranching. Your industry example. Now, when we say industry, think of industry as a big umbrella. Okay? And everything under that umbrella deals with that industry. If we're talking about ranching, we're talking about ranching industry from everything from raising the cattle, feeding the cattle, making sure they're healthy, selling the cattle, and then how are we going to get the cattle to market? How are you going to take the cattle from West Texas to East Texas? Trains. So railroads grow out of this industry because we need railroads to take the cattle to East Texas or to the eastern coast. Then what do we need? Can I go serve you a cow on a platter?
No.
Here's a spoon and a fork and a knife. You have to butcher it. You have to take it to a meat processing plant. That's part of the cattle industry. So you take the cow from the farm or from the ranch to the railroad to the meat processing plant. Then you take it from there and you take it to different restaurants. And at the restaurant, then they can serve it to you. Okay? But all of those are industries. Okay? You have the car industry. That's another great example. You have the places that make the car, like the GM plant in Arlington, all the way to the little mechanic shop on the corner that can go change your oil for you. Okay, that's the industry. And industry is not referring to a specific store, but more in general how things get to where you're at. Okay? So that's profit and industry dealing with ranching. Okay? If we look at all of these things combined, supply and demand, boom and bust, and profit and industry, are these only related to ranching?
No.
Or can we apply these three concepts to the oil industry? Can we apply these three concepts to the car industry? Yes, these are three general economic terms that we can apply to any industry or any business. Could we apply supply and demand to Del Taco down the road? Yeah, we could. If they had a huge supply and nobody wanted to eat at Del Taco, what's going to happen to that restaurant? It's going to bust. But because everybody likes Del Taco, this summer, what was happening to that store? Cars were wrapped everywhere, weren't they? Okay? So, you can't even apply this to restaurants. Okay? Now, do you guys have any questions? Make sure your notes are on page 56 and 57 of your spiral.